Furthermore, from the moment the task force went into action on March 18th, the kamikazes, one-way missions, began coming in, and they proved to be more troublesome at Okinawa than they had ever been before. Radford's Enterprise was hit by a bomb, Intrepid was damaged by a near miss, and Yorktown was bombed successfully by a non-kamikaze bomber. One bomb blew 2 big holes in her. Next day, Admiral Davison's Wasp was bombed so successfully that fires broke out on 5 decks, and 101 men were killed and 269 wounded. The damage seemed almost as severe as that to old Lexington at Coral Sea, but such were the improvements in the new carriers in terms of firefighting and damage control that Wasp continued to operate for several days. Davison's flagship, the Franklin, was even worse hit. One bomb wrecked the forward elevator and started many fires on the hangar deck. A second bomb hit the flight deck, set fire to planes that were ready to launch, and bathed the ship in flame. Admiral Davison and Admiral Bogan, who was riding as an observer, left the ship to transfer to the Hancock, and Davidson told Captain Leslie Gares to abandon ship. Gares sent all but his essential officers and men over the side. Franklin went dead in the water, but Gares and his men saved the ship and eventually took her back to the United States under her own power. Those 2 bombs caused the deaths of 725 men and the wounding of 265 more. That was the way it went at Okinawa. As the Americans moved into the Ryukyus, of which Okinawa is the largest island, the Japanese defences stiffened even more than in the past. The Japanese brought out special suicide gliders called Baka bombs. They manned suicide boats filled with explosives. On March 25th, the bombardment of Okinawa began, and so did the kamikaze attacks. From this point on, they would be regular, day by day, coming in groups of 1 to 20 or in huge waves. Spruance was on hand in the Indianapolis for the bombardment, and on March 31st, D1, his flagship was hit by a kamikaze. 4 attacked, 3 were shot down, and 1 crashed into the ship's port quarter. 9 men were killed and 20 wounded, but Spruance was untouched. The landings at Okinawa were fairly easy. General Ushijima, the Japanese commander, had decided to make his stand in the hills around Naha and on the Motobu Peninsula, rather than concentrate his strength to oppose the landings. Spruance was not there. Indianapolis had gone to the base at Kerama-Retto for repairs. Later, Spruance transferred to the New Mexico, and Indianapolis went back to the United States for overhaul. The suicide planes demanded new techniques to counter the threat, and Kelly Turner developed them. 16 radar picket ships were established around Okinawa to intercept and report on incoming enemy flights. These were strengthened by 2 ships as the pickets began to take a beating from the kamikazes. What the Japanese called Operation Tengo began on April 6th with a raid of 355 kamikazes. They got 3 destroyers, 2 ammunition ships, and an LST. They damaged 9 destroyers and escorts, a mine layer, and a dozen other ships. Altogether, before Okinawa was taken, the kamikazes sank 26 ships and damaged 200, including 6 carriers. Involved in these raids were regular planes and 1,900 kamikazes, 250 of them coming from Formosa and the rest from Japan. Roughly, 1 in 10 of these planes got through the American fire. On April 6th and 7, Spruance and Mitcher found and tracked the Japanese super battleship Yamato, which had come out with a light cruiser and 8 destroyers. Spruance was in a position to decide how to destroy Yamato at this point in the war. Should it be by the fast carriers, which could certainly do the job, or should he let the old battleships have a little fun? Rear Admiral Morton L. Deo had these battleships, 6 of them, with 7 cruisers and 21 destroyers as a fire support force. Spruance decided, too, to go along in his flagship, but on April 7th it appeared that the Yamato was not coming direct and might get away. Mitcher asked Spruance, "Will you take them or shall I?" And Spruance gave up the chance for the gun duel. "You take them," he said. Mitcher took them. In an hour and a half, the planes of his fast carrier force put 9 torpedoes and 5 1,000 pounds bombs into Yamato. She capsized, blew up, and sank. The carrier planes also sank the light cruiser and 4 of the 8 destroyers, damaging all 4 of the others. By this time, no more proof of the vast power of the fast carrier forces was needed. What was happening now, as far as Japanese naval vessels were concerned, was that they had become tidbits for the fast carriers to digest amid the more prosaic but essential tasks of hitting the Japanese at home and protecting the fleet from the dying gasps of Japanese land-based air defence. Spruance continued in command of what had become a drawn-out and wearing operation. He brought battle repair ships to the area. He worked out new dispositions and ship movements. Spruance grew impatient with the Army's method of advance. On May 13th, he wrote to his old Chief of Staff, Captain Moore. The Japanese casualties reported by the 10th Army are pure estimates, not actual counts of dead Japanese. I don't take these estimates much more seriously than I do the Japanese figures on our casualties. Since the push started on the 19th of April, we have advanced about 4,000 yards. There are times when I get impatient for some of Holland Smith's drive, but there is nothing we can do about it. Iwo was a very tough job for the Marines, but they finished it up in 26 days. I doubt if the Army's slow, methodical method of fighting really saves any lives in the long run. It merely spreads the casualties over a longer period. The longer period greatly increases the Navy casualties when Japanese air attack on ships is a continuing factor. However, I do not believe the Army is at all allergic to losses of naval ships and personnel. May 12th Spruance had a narrow escape. New Mexico had gone to Karamaretto to take on ammunition and left late in the afternoon to return to Okinawa and anchor for the night. Spruance described the event to Moore. Just about sundown, 2 low-flying bogies came in through our radar pickets from the westward, presumably from Formosa. A few minutes before we anchored, they arrived on the scene, picked out the New Mexico, his flagship, and dived on her. One was shot down, landing in the water close aboard on our port quarter. A few moments later, the other landed on us, coming in on the starboard side, just about the foremast structure. The bomb went off on the superstructure deck just about the foremast, while the plane crashed in the uptake space on the forward side of the stack. The most curious part of the whole business was that ammunition from the anti-aircraft battery was knocked down into the hole made by the plane and fell through the battle bars into several of the boilers, where it went off, putting 3 of our 4 boilers out of commission, probably for several days. The casualties were about 50 killed, mostly in the anti-aircraft batteries, but some on the quarterdeck, either from strafing or from fire from other ships. About 80 men seriously wounded, and a good many more with minor injuries. Except for several of Slonim's men, Slonim was the Japanese language expert, who were close to the bomb explosion, the staff had no casualties. Slonim had just left there to come aft to tell me the Japanese planes were close. Otherwise he would have been killed. Burns, the meteorological officer, was knocked down on our signal bridge, but not hurt. I had just started for the bridge when the AA batteries opened up, so I remained under cover while going forward on the second deck, and we were hit before I got very far, which was fortunate for me, as the 2 routes to the bridge led right through the area where the plane and bomb hit. This is my second experience with a suicide plane making a hit on board my own ship, and I have seen 4 other ships hit near me. The suicide plane is a very effective weapon which we must not underestimate. I don't believe anyone who had not been around within this area of operation can realize its potentialities against ships. It is the opposite extreme from a lot of our Army heavy bombers, who bomb safely and ineffectively from the upper atmosphere. Spruance grew very restless, as his letter indicated. He liked to go ashore, but General Buckner did not like it at all. Okinawa was hardly safe, and Buckner could not guarantee Spruance's safety. Spruance was delighted then to be relieved late in May by Admiral Halsey, who had taken home leave and then spent the last 6 weeks in Pearl Harbor planning. One plan called for the invasion of the China coast 100 miles south of Shanghai. The other, which appealed to Halsey, was an assault on Kyushu. Nimitz made several changes all at the same time. Spruance was recalled. Turner, promoted to full admiral, was brought back with Spruance, and Harry Hill, promoted to vice admiral, was sent to supervise the remainder of the Okinawa operation, along with Admiral McCain, who relieved Mitchell as commander of the fast carriers. It might appear that the Okinawa operation was over, but such was hardly the case. It had seemed easy. The Marines had done so well in the beginning that Kelly Turner had returned the 2nd Marine Division, which was in reserve, and it had gone to Guam in April. But the Japanese were very tough, and in June Hill had to bring them back. Spruance had already suggested to Nimitz that the target date for the landing on the Chinese coast be August 15th, which meant there was little time if that was to be carried out. He had never liked the idea of a Japan landing. The question of what operations should be undertaken after Okinawa, Spruance said, whether to the coast of China or to the main islands of Japan, was a most important one. It was my opinion at the time, and I have never had any reason to change it, that landings in Japan proper, such as the planned Kyushu on the 1st of November 1945, were not necessary and would have been extremely costly. Nimitz, all this while, was having serious difficulties of his own at Guam. It seemed that General MacArthur was trying to move in on him. On April 13th, Lieutenant General Sutherland and General Kenny arrived at Guam to discuss future command relationships. Sutherland began that evening to lay out MacArthur's ideas. As soon as possible, Sutherland said, MacArthur intended to take command of all army forces in the Pacific, including the garrisons of the islands under Nimitz. All previous command arrangements had been unsatisfactory to the army, Sutherland said, and the principle of unity of command was an unworkable shibboleth. Warming to his idea, Sutherland said further that in the future no army troops were going to serve under any admiral. Sutherland had apparently been deluded by Nimitz's mild manners into believing that the admiral would take such dicta lying down. He was quickly disabused of the notion. He was informed, Nimitz told King in a radio message, that unity of command in the Pacific Ocean areas had gotten us through our period of adversity and moved us to the inner approaches of Japan, and was the only feasible arrangement for operating and defending an area and coordinating area matters. Nimitz said he would relinquish the control of troops to MacArthur as they came out of operations. However, the essential garrison of all positions in the Pacific Ocean areas must remain under my operational control as long as I am responsible for those areas. Abolition of unity of command in the Suburias and outlying islands would produce chaos and would retard the prosecution of the war. I shall not, therefore, accede to his assuming operational control of army forces, ground, air, or service, which are essential to the defence and functions of the Pacific Ocean areas. Nimitz informed King that MacArthur was planning to take over the Ryukyus too, and to mount an assault on Kyushu in November. The next day the conferences continued. Sutherland and Kenny made detailed proposals to take over the Ryukyus operation, which included Okinawa. MacArthur had told them to do so because the Ryukyus were his paramount interest as the axis of his advance into Japan. Kenny wanted to move the 5th Air Force into Okinawa, to which Nimitz saw no objection at all, except that of overall command. They discussed Operation Olympic, which was to be the invasion of Japan. They agreed that MacArthur would draft a plan and send it to Nimitz, who would redraft and revise as he saw fit, and they would meet in Manila for another planning conference. Nimitz informed King that the one difficulty was the matter of command relationships, and, of course, unless he was prepared to take the back seat, this difficulty would continue. An interesting sidelight, Nimitz added, is that Sutherland says MacArthur will land in Kyushu about D+3, stay a short time, and then return to Manila until time for the Honshu landing. Later that day, Nimitz quite lost his patience with the MacArthur representatives when they delivered a paper making the same proposals that had been turned down the day before, adding that Nimitz should take over operational control of naval operations in the Southwest Pacific. The idea was very clearly to push Nimitz into accepting MacArthur as his boss. Since these ideas were consuming valuable time and delaying constructive planning, Nimitz told King, I authorized McMorris to inform Sutherland in writing as follows. Then Nimitz detailed what he would do and would not do. First, he said it was important to arrange method, time, and place for coordination of the invasion planning and preparations ordered by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This was a veiled reminder to MacArthur that the Joint Chiefs of Staff were in control. Such coordination was necessary, Nimitz said, so that he could plan the naval and amphibious operations. Once, and hopefully for all, he stipulated what he would and would not do. He would not transfer shore positions to MacArthur. He would not relinquish control of army forces. He would control all these forces unless the Joint Chiefs ordered him to do otherwise. He would also control logistics in his area unless ordered otherwise. He would not take over MacArthur's naval forces. He would provide naval cover and would provide naval forces to operate under MacArthur. There was more talk. To give them a carrot as well as the stick, Nimitz finally agreed that he might reconsider giving MacArthur operational control of shore positions after Okinawa was taken, or when a firm directive is received for the Olympic operation. But as it developed, the MacArthur representatives were in no position to talk about anything except MacArthur's demands, which had been rejected. It now appears that the SWPA party will leave at 160800, April 16, 8 a.m. Very little useful discussion has taken place concerning invasion plans and preparations, and the SWPA party was apparently not prepared for such discussion, Nimitz said wryly to King. MacArthur was completely unyielding in the matter of control and command. He would not come to Guam to confer with Nimitz. For a time, Nimitz attempted to solve their mutual problems by sending emissaries, usually Forrest Sherman, to Manila to talk with MacArthur's staff. MacArthur's sense of protocol was such that Sherman was able to accomplish relatively little. In May, Nimitz again went to see MacArthur in the interest of solving their problems. The problems revolved around the concept of the war, but it was becoming apparent that MacArthur was winning the struggle. With the defeat of Germany, General Marshall and the chiefs of the Army and the Air Force suddenly realized that the Pacific was very heavily a Navy show. The way to make it an Army show was to create the need for employment of huge numbers of troops and military equipment. This meant, and could only mean, the invasion of Japan itself. The Navy's concept of moving into the Chinese coast had always depended on the establishment of bases and the maintenance of naval and air support by the Americans, but the use of Chinese manpower on the continent. These were points that Nimitz had made time and again in the conferences with King. By the time of the Okinawa invasion, the complexion of the war against Japan had changed. The British definitely had come into the war, and Spruance had very successfully used his British Task Force 57 in the campaign. Upon Marshall's insistence, said Admiral King, which also reflected MacArthur's views, the Joint Chiefs had prepared plans for landings in Kyushu and eventually in the Tokyo Plain. King and Leahy did not like the idea, but as unanimous decisions were necessary in the Joint Chiefs meetings, they reluctantly acquiesced, feeling that in the end sea power would accomplish the defeat of Japan, as proved to be the case. The decision had been that MacArthur would be in charge of the ground forces in the campaign, while Nimitz would assist MacArthur in establishing a large beachhead from which the army troops could operate, as well as helping with naval gunfire, naval aviation, logistic support, and anti-submarine operations. With Franklin Roosevelt's death on April 12th, the situation became even more murky, but by May it was fairly well indicated that the MacArthur approach was going to be hard to overcome. The difficulties were readily apparent in the past operations in the Philippines, where Halsey had complained about the MacArthur policy of maintaining Army, Air Force, and Navy commands as separate and equal under his overall leadership. The Navy theory was precisely opposite, but political and international considerations now became far more important than before. Congressmen began coming out to the Pacific for tours, as Senator Tidings of Maryland did with a party at the end of May. Special representatives of the State Department showed up for duty at Guam because diplomatic considerations were arising. Even the Reconstruction Finance Corporation now became involved in the Pacific, in the islands taken from the Japanese. Early in June, as Halsey was getting ready to make more airstrikes in support of the Okinawa operations, he ran into another storm. The storm was off to the southwest of the fleet, and on the afternoon of June 4th, Admiral Halsey set a course away from the storm for his fleet, while some of the ships began fueling. On the evening of June 4th, reports began to come in from Guam about the storm centres to the west and southwest. They were moving east, but Halsey's advisers convinced him to move to the northwest, and they did so, right into the track of the storm, which was the recurving of the typhoon. Admiral Clark suggested that they head away, and so did Admiral Hill, but Halsey refused, guided by his own aerographer. The result, again, was heavy damage to the ships. In Clark's task group, the Hornet and Bennington both suffered partial flight deck collapse when steel girders broke. The heavy cruiser Pittsburgh lost her bow. Belleau Wood lost a man overboard. Altogether, 33 ships were damaged, 142 planes were destroyed, and 6 men were lost. Again there was a court of inquiry, and again Admiral Hoover presided. Again he was inclined to recommend the court-martial of Admiral Halsey for carelessness in this disaster. Admiral Lockwood was a member of the court, and he summed up the problem pithily. The whole matter certainly is a mess, and indicates that nobody ever heard of a guy named Bowditch. The recommendation of the court was very strong against Halsey, McCain, and Jocko Clark, whose force had been hard hit. It went to the Secretary of the Navy, and for a time there was talk of retiring Halsey. But one did not court-martial or retire America's favourite and most famous fighting admiral, particularly if one was Secretary of the Navy with a very strong bent for public relations. Nimitz, however, was thoroughly annoyed with Halsey, and their correspondence from that point on took on a definitely cooler tone. Actually, the coolness had begun with the first typhoon, for Nimitz had also considered that to be a totally unnecessary disaster. Admiral Clark had been criticised for not moving independently quickly enough, in view of the directive from Nimitz after the first typhoon, which instructed commanders to inform Nimitz directly when they were in weather trouble. But Clark took the position that as a rear admiral he could scarcely go over the heads of McCain and Halsey, and it seemed a reasonable position. An indication of Nimitz's loss of confidence in Halsey came in his direct correspondence with Admiral Hill on matters concerning the naval forces around Okinawa that summer. Halsey objected to Nimitz's dealing directly with Hill. "I would feel a great deal better if my own recommendations were sought rather than one of my subordinates," he told Nimitz. "I will be much better able to execute your orders, directives, and policies if you can see your way clear to working through me." There were other complaints. The carrier task group commanders found Halsey extremely difficult to work for. The fact was that carrier warfare had become so improved and so complicated when Halsey was managing the South Pacific campaign from Noumea that he had gotten out of touch with the techniques as they developed. Instead of starting out afresh, finding himself a new staff of men who had matured rapidly in these 2 years of modern carrier warfare, Halsey had stubbornly, loyally stuck with his old staff. The result, as some carrier task group commanders indicated, was very often near chaos. "When Admiral Spruance was in command," said Admiral Arthur Radford, "you knew precisely what he was going to do. The orders were written clearly and delivered promptly, and except for tactical changes, they stood as written. But when Admiral Halsey was in command, you never knew what he was going to do. Every night the changes would come in the night orders, and often, as the commanders complained, the changes were so complicated and referred to so many different messages that the staffs of the task groups spent hours puzzling over the message board, hoping they knew at the end what Halsey intended to do and what action they were supposed to take. And as Nimitz cooled down, the relationship bettered that summer, although it would never again be as close as during those days of desperation in the South Pacific when Halsey was truly carrying the war. In mid-June, the Third Fleet was relieved of its responsibility to cover the Okinawa struggle, and Halsey went to Manila, where Japanese resistance was just being ended. He found MacArthur jubilant and cheerful, understandably. It was becoming an army war, as far as he was concerned. By July 1st, Admiral Hill's amphibious force was no longer needed at Okinawa, and it was dissolved. Admiral Oldendorf was promoted to Vice Admiral and given a new striking force of cruisers and destroyers to ravage Japanese shipping in the home waters. This task was already being performed handsomely by Admiral Lockwood's submarines, and early in July Halsey was again turned loose, this time to go into Japanese waters and hit Japan itself. His task force, still under McCain, consisted of 3 groups under Rear Admirals T.L. Sprague, G.F. Bogan and Arthur Radford. Admiral Jocko Clark had been relieved, and he was certainly entitled to a rest after many months of command in the Pacific. His attorney at the Court of Inquiry had subjected Admiral Halsey to very severe questioning too, and it took no genius to realize Clark's future relationship with Halsey and McCain could scarcely be very cordial, although in his writing and public statements Halsey never said a word of criticism of his junior. Halsey struck the Japanese islands repeatedly, against very little opposition, and Admiral Shafroth struck with a bombardment force of battleships and cruisers. From now until the end of the war, the Americans prowled the Japanese waters almost at will, exercising their overwhelming naval and air force. Meanwhile, Nimitz and MacArthur were trying to sort out the elements of command. Perhaps the most helpful person in this series of discussions was Admiral Kincaid, who had the respect and liking of both men. Nimitz had been disturbed by Sutherland's statements that MacArthur would not permit a single soldier to be commanded by Admiral Turner or any other admiral. How could the Navy carry out its amphibious responsibilities? Kincaid took the matter up with MacArthur, and the general was disturbed. He noted that General Sutherland often got off on the wrong foot. He also corrected the impression Sutherland had given that MacArthur would not remain in command in Kyushu. MacArthur said he saw no reason for disagreement with Nimitz or the Navy. Kincaid mentioned the Turner-Richardson unpleasantness at Saipan, and MacArthur suggested that Richardson was responsible. Kincaid spoke of the difficulty of turning over army forces to MacArthur's command, and MacArthur seemed to be completely reasonable. The general said, of course, it is not possible now to turn over to him the control of army forces actually engaged in current operations. What he wanted was to get General Richardson and his staff into the MacArthur command, since they had been transferred to MacArthur and MacArthur's title had been changed to Commander-in-Chief of Army Forces, Pacific Theatre. At the end of June, Nimitz went back to the mainland again for meetings with King. Operation Olympic, the invasion of Japan, was very definitely in the schedule, and so tremendous a movement that it would have staggered an officer of the old pre-war Navy to consider. For example, no fewer than 9 amphibious groups would be employed under Admiral Turner, with 4 more in reserve. King and Nimitz talked of demobilization, of reorganization of the Pacific Fleet commands, and of relationships with the Russians and with the British. King still kept coming back to the idea of invading the China coast as a possible alternative to the invasion of the Tokyo Plain. By this time in the history of the Pacific War, the Navy had completely reversed itself in the matter of public relations. Captain Miller was to become Rear Admiral H.B. Miller and head of Navy Public Relations. Kelly Turner, who had refused to have a public relations officer on his ship in the Gilbert's operation, showed the change in a letter to Secretary Forrestal. In the Okinawa campaign, I think we have had a tremendous success from the public relations viewpoint. I have letters from 3 of the voice networks and from all of the major wire services thanking us for what has been given to them. Of course, this just didn't happen. Admiral Nimitz and his staff have pushed us hard to conform to your ideas as to news. My orders to everyone, as for 3 years, are that the Navy is owned by the American people and that the owners are entitled to know about us. Then I have had as Perot on my staff for this operation Paul Smith of the SF Chronicle, who is about the best newspaperman I know about. Even Terrible Turner was mellowing. Turner was busy, as always, planning for the invasion of Japan. He would take charge of the overall amphibious command, and he selected Vice Admiral Wilkinson to be his understudy, prepared to take over if my ship is hit and I can no longer function. This is going to be tough for all of us, and I hope you will give your best advice not only on the major organization, but also on the general plans for all parts of it. I do not intend to go into intricate details in my orders, but to decentralize as much as possible. Of course, I will issue general orders concerning the screen and various methods of protecting ships, but I do not intend to take charge of them myself, except as to coordination, but to assign responsibility for the various areas to you, Hill, Barbie, and Connolly. The headiness of victory was already in the air at home, and it had begun to create problems for the Pacific forces. Although the submarine force was at a peak in July 1945, the pressure was on Nimitz to give up the Royal Hawaiian Hotel, which the submariners had been using as a base for rest and recuperation between patrols. The civilians wanted their world back. In July, Nimitz and MacArthur were still trying to iron out difficulties in the matching of their commands and responsibilities. Nimitz suggested that MacArthur make his advance headquarters for the coming operations on Guam. "I can make available to you quarters identical with my own." But MacArthur had no intention of coming to a naval sphere of influence, and they continued their discussions by letter, by message, and by visits from members of the staffs. Nimitz's concern was the retention of command when the major responsibility for the Japanese invasion moved to MacArthur. It will undoubtedly become necessary in the future for fleet units, including carriers, to attack targets in the inland sea and to operate not only in the Philippine Sea west of the 135th meridian, but also in the East China Sea, later in the Sea of Japan, and possibly also in the Yellow Sea, he told MacArthur. "I must retain complete freedom of action in such matters subject to the realities of the strategic and tactical situations as they develop." By mid-July, the command struggle had not been settled. Nimitz insisted on keeping his command of the Pacific Ocean areas and everything in it. MacArthur wanted to take over the army forces in the Pacific and give Nimitz the 7th Fleet and all naval forces. But Nimitz would not budge, so MacArthur would not budge either. Nimitz believed MacArthur was trying to take complete control of the operations against Japan, and MacArthur denied it, then complained to the Joint Chiefs of Staff that Nimitz would not cooperate. On July 17th, Kinkaid met with MacArthur and tried to resolve the dispute. "My estimate is that it all adds up to this," Kinkaid wrote Nimitz: "horse trading. He wants control of all my forces in the Central Pacific, and he believes that he will get proper support from the Navy by coordinated action." The matter remained unsettled. Late in July, the cruiser Indianapolis returned from the west coast, where she had been repaired following the kamikaze attack at Okinawa. She brought with her parts for the atomic bombs, which were being stockpiled in the Marianas. She came to Guam briefly and went out on a mission. She was between Guam and the Philippines when she was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. Partly because of the split command, Guam was SINCPAC. Tacloban, where she was heading, was 7th Fleet. No one paid any attention to the non-arrival of the cruiser on her stipulated day. Meanwhile, she sank and her survivors floated in the sea for 84 hours before the oil slick of the cruiser attracted the attention of a patrol bomber. Only 316 men survived, nearly 900 died. Admiral Nimitz ordered a court of inquiry, and the captain of the Indianapolis was court-martialed. At Guam, in June and July 1945, Nimitz and Sherman prepared a plan for the occupation of the Tokyo Bay area by the Third Fleet, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff agreed to the idea, since it would be several weeks before the army forces could be brought into action. MacArthur objected strenuously, however, on the grounds that the Navy could not handle the job, or perhaps because the Army and the Air Corps would be upset if the Navy moved in first. Now came a series of military-political discussions about the occupation of China, Korea, and Manchuria that are beyond the scope of this book, except to note that in these decisions rested much of the difficulty in which the world was to find itself in Asia for the next quarter-century. Quick decisions, some based on erroneous assumptions, were made at the highest military level, that of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, affecting Korea, Manchuria, North China, Netherlands, East Indies, Malaya, and Indochina. The demand on the Japanese for unconditional surrender and the total collapse of Japanese power in these areas, with no orderly plan for government, brought about a state of almost unlimited chaos. Such considerations were simply beyond the command scope of the Pacific Fleet. It was difficult enough for Nimitz and MacArthur, with their differing philosophies of the war, to reach agreement on the occupation. MacArthur, for example, claimed then and thereafter that the Central Pacific campaign was expensive and wasteful in lives. At Okinawa, he said, the Japanese sank 36 ships, damaged 368, and destroyed 800 American planes. These figures exceed the entire American losses in the SWPA from Melbourne to Tokyo. Again, the problem of command had arisen. It would not be solved in this war, for events began moving much too rapidly. On August 1st, Admiral Halsey was busy avoiding a new typhoon, but ready to operate against the Japanese islands as the weather bettered. On August 6th, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. Then came the second A-bomb dropped on Nagasaki. When Nimitz had the news, he was deeply shocked. He had known for some time about the weapon, but no one knew precisely what it could do. Halsey was shocked too. "I am looking forward to seeing you," Halsey wrote on August 9th, "and am anxious to hear what you can tell me about this appalling new weapon and about future developments." The results were still obscure, but the developments came quickly. The Russians declared war on Japan. On August 10th, King sent Nimitz a message. "This is a peace warning," it began, then went on to state that Japan was ready to surrender. A few days later, Japan did agree to unconditional surrender. On August 13th, Admiral Sherman was in Manila, conferring with MacArthur. The general's policy had stiffened completely, as Sherman reported to Nimitz. He considers that as Supreme Allied Commander he is now fully responsible for and commands all phases of the occupation of Japan. He desires no communication with Japanese authorities by forces in the Pacific except through his headquarters. He expects to summon Japanese representatives to Manila to make a preliminary arrangement for the surrender. He reiterated in most emphatic terms his disapproval of the use of a fleet landing force prior to the clearance of Japanese forces from the area under armistice arrangements. This disapproval is based both on military grounds and effect on service relationships. And so the war ended, a very different war from the one that had begun on December 7th, 1941. The Japanese, fearing a growing American military power and refusal to accept their expansion in East Asia and the Pacific Ocean, had attacked swiftly to break American naval power. The Japanese intent was to consolidate a Pacific empire before the Americans could move, and to inflict enough defeats on the United States and her allies in this period to cause them to make a peace that gave the Japanese what they wanted in the Pacific. The first part of the Japanese plan had succeeded only too well. American power was destroyed at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese went on to victories in the Philippines and on the shores of the China Seas that surprised even the Japanese High Command with their ease and swiftness. But there was an element missing. The Japanese had not gotten the American carriers, and armed with these weapons, supported by cruisers and destroyers, and manned by determined and angry men, the American Navy set out to avenge the disgrace of Pearl Harbor. In the South Pacific, the Americans and the Australians gained a foothold when they decided that the Japanese must be stopped at the Solomons. The struggle there was desperate, for the Japanese position was in many ways stronger than the Allied. The Japanese had air power at hand through their island chain, and their fleet units were better disposed and better trained in the beginning than the American and the Australian. From the South Pacific, the real battle against Japan moved to the Central Pacific and the submarine campaign. General MacArthur took some territory, but his victories in this period served largely to keep the Japanese off balance and to occupy certain forces. The war was being won by submarines and the Central Pacific forces. The casualty figures showed that much. It was the Nimitz command that fought the battles and took the territory essential to the maintenance of the Japanese Empire, as it had been planned to exist after 1942. In 1943, the gallant men of the submarines and the surface fleet, the carriers and the assault forces carried the war. Meanwhile, more and better carriers, submarines and other ships were being built at furious speed on the coasts of America. In 1944 they began coming in force to the Pacific, and along with them came thousands of men who had been civilians a short time before and were now deep-water sailors. Some of these men sailed directly from American ports into battle, never having been across the sea before, an immense tribute to the American Reserve Navy. By 1944, the handwriting was on the wall for any gloomy Japanese admiral to read. There were too many ships, too many planes, too many guns, too many submarines, too many troops coming ashore in too many transports, and the island empire simply could not withstand the pressure for long. No matter how gallant the Japanese, they could not bring their iron and coal and special metals to Japan if the ships were sunk, and the ships were sunk by the dozens and the hundreds. So the gun factories and the shell factories and the airplane factories began to go idle, as the overwhelming American might was brought to crush Japan. In 1945, Germany was defeated, and then the whole of Western Allied power could be turned against Japan. Britain was able and eager to bring her fleets to the Pacific, to show the Union Jack and recover the prestige lost in the fall of Singapore and the sinking of the great battleships Repulse and Prince of Wales. By the summer of 1945, scarcely a ship could sail from the far reaches of the Japanese Empire and hope to reach the Central Islands. American submarines were penetrating the inland sea regularly and without fear. When the atomic bomb came, Japan was already virtually defeated. The Navy men said she was defeated, and what remained was to pick up the piece and stage manage the surrender. The A-bombs were the spectacular weapons, but it was certain that Japan was beaten by the overwhelming industrial might of the United States, and that the A-bomb simply allowed the Americans to take over Japan and force the debatable policy of unconditional surrender down the Japanese throats without further American bloodshed. The formal Japanese surrender was signed aboard Admiral Halsey's flagship, the battleship Missouri, and nearly every general and admiral alive who had played a significant part in the Pacific War was invited, with the exception of Holland Smith. When the occupation began, Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher had a role to play, Hokkaido, and so did nearly all others. Admiral Harry Hill noted the oversight, and, in a message to Nimitz, suggested that he would be pleased to have Holland Smith as his guest when Hill moved in to deliver his share of the occupation forces. "Negative," came the answer from Admiral Nimitz. That was the only really sour note. There was a sad note. 4 days after the surrender, Admiral McCain died of a heart attack, the first of Nimitz's admirals to go since Admiral Henry Mullenix on the Liscombe Bay at the Gilberts, not counting Willis A. Lee, who died of a heart attack on August 25, 1945, but who was not in the Pacific at the moment. So Nimitz and his admirals had come to the natural end of the line without solving the problem of command between Army and Navy. The problem would continue and still be debated between Army and Navy commanders a quarter of a century later, whether the theatre command or the unified command system was more workable. Nimitz continued on as Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet in the summer and fall of 1945. Admiral Halsey, the ebullient fighter, stayed in the public eye. He occupied Yokosuka Naval Base. Once he had boasted that he would ride Emperor Hirohito's white horse down the streets of Tokyo. Now he was persuaded to board a white horse, and Americans smiled at the didos of one of their favorite heroes. He came home to a hero's welcome, to receive a gold star in lieu of a 4th Distinguished Service Medal, and to retire with the rank of Fleet Admiral. Even at the end, Halsey was his old self, outspoken and in trouble. He spoke out flatly against the use of the atomic bomb, blaming the scientists who had worked on it as much as the politicians. The scientists took umbrage. A representative of the Federation of American Scientists demanded a retraction or a disavowal of Halsey's statements. Nimitz replied soothingly, also in character. "I hope that Admiral Halsey's clarifying press statement will inform the public of his real intentions in this matter," said Nimitz, "and that our scientists will continue to accept him as the heroic and indomitable naval leader that he is. It would be most unfortunate for a rift to develop between the personnel of the Navy and the scientists of this country, whose work is so essential to our progress." But as far as the Navy was concerned, Halsey had come to the end of his career. He was a fighting admiral, and the Pacific War had shown him at his finest, with all his faults. He was one of the great naval figures of all time, and his contributions to the Pacific victory in the early days of the war and in the South Pacific campaign endeared him past criticism to Chester W. Nimitz. Halsey knew that the path for him was retirement, and he left the active service with an easy heart. Spruance relieved Halsey as commander of the fleet, which once again became Fifth Fleet. Kelly Turner retired after some time as U.S. representative to the UN. Harry Hill organized and commanded a brand new National War College, which was organized because in the vast expansion of the services, Army and Navy war colleges could not handle the task of training officers for command. Admiral Towers finally got his sea command. He replaced McCain as commander of the fast carrier task forces. Mitchell went to Washington to become Vice Chief of Naval Operations, Air. Among the others, Admiral Kimmel never secured the public vindication he sought almost until his death, a sad story of a man whose career was sacrificed. Yet it was the Navy way. A captain may not go down with his ship in the 20th century, but his career usually does. Admiral Pye had been at the Naval War College. He retired. Admiral Fletcher became chairman of the General Board until retirement in 1947. Admiral Dremel continued at the Philadelphia Navy Yard and retired in 1946. Admiral Brown was relieved as aide to the President after Franklin Roosevelt died, then went to the Bureau of Personnel until he retired shortly after the Japanese surrender. Admiral Gormley's career recovered considerably in the last months of the war. He had been the victim of confusion and change, given a huge command and multifarious responsibilities in the South Pacific, from diplomatic to logistic. When the fighting became desperate at Guadalcanal, he was simply overwhelmed and did not respond quickly enough to suit Nimitz, who nevertheless had great respect for Gormley's abilities. Those abilities carried him to become commander of American naval forces in Germany in 1944, and to supervise the demilitarization of the German Navy and to act as a diplomat. He did an outstanding job and was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal, then was appointed to the General Board of the Navy. Admiral Fitch left the office of Chief of Naval Operations to become the first aviator superintendent of the United States Naval Academy. He established the Department of Aeronautics there. He served later in the office of the Undersecretary of the Navy and then retired in 1947. Hill was superintendent until 1952. Admiral Hoover replaced Admiral Towers in Pearl Harbor when Towers went to the task force. He served for several months at Pearl Harbor and then returned to the United States. As for Admiral Nimitz, his post-war career was more difficult than might be imagined. He came home a hero in the fall of 1945 and was feted in Texas and elsewhere. But there were problems. The principal problem was a tension that existed between Nimitz and Secretary Forrestal. Actually, Forrestal did not want Nimitz to become Chief of Naval Operations, the one post to which Nimitz aspired. In October the matter came to a head, as the Forrestal diaries indicate. The 6th of October, 1945. Admiral Nimitz came in this morning. He said he hoped to relieve Admiral King. I told him my own view was that he could be of greater use and more effective to the Navy without being tied to the routine of such an exacting job as CNO. He replied that he was fully aware of how exacting it would be in the next 2 years, but in spite of that still wanted to do it, and said he was confident that both as regards relations with Congress, knowledge of the Navy, and support of the service, he could do a good job. The 10th of October, 1945. I spoke to Admiral Nimitz today about our conversation. I said that if he wished to succeed King, that I would so recommend to the President with these qualifications. 1. That his staff should be mutually agreeable to the two of us, and 2. That his term be limited to 2 years, and 3. That he subscribe in general principle to the conception of the Navy Department organization as expressed in the new chart. So Nimitz did succeed King as Chief of Naval Operations when Admiral King retired at the end of the year. It was not altogether a happy assignment, for Nimitz and Forrestal did not like one another, and on Nimitz rested the problem of moving the Navy into the new Department of Defense single-service concept. There were incidents and there was unhappiness. Nimitz did not really want the job in some ways. He took it, he said, because he felt that if he was not given that job, it would hurt the morale of the Naval Officer Corps. Nimitz was relieved as commander of the Pacific Fleet by Admiral Spruance. Spruance then went on to the presidency of the Naval War College. Nimitz became relatively inactive after his term as Chief of Naval Operations, although as a fleet admiral he never retired. At the end of his Washington stay, he moved to San Francisco. In 1949 he was appointed administrator of the planned plebiscite in Kashmir, but it never materialized. He did spend some time on United Nations affairs and became a regent of the University of California. He was called upon for much speaking and writing, particularly of prefaces for books about the Pacific War. Many attempts were made to persuade him to write his memoirs, but he flatly refused. He had hoped that his son or one of his daughters would undertake a biography, but Chester Nimitz Jr. was busy with naval affairs and then joined the Perkin-Elmer Company of Norwalk, Connecticut, on his retirement as Rear Admiral and immersed himself in the business world. The daughters were busy with their own pursuits, one a Navy wife, one a nun, and one a scholar with the Rand Corporation. Nimitz lived quietly in a house near the university, and then moved into naval quarters at the naval station on Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay, where he lived even more quietly until his death in 1966. Then he was buried in Golden Gate National Cemetery, next to Kelly Turner. Later, Charles Lockwood was buried there. In 1969, Raymond Spruance joined them, above the wide Pacific, where they had fought so gloriously. Spruance had retired as president of the Naval War College after a distinguished tenure, although he never achieved the 5-star rank he wanted and deserved. Nimitz had recommended Spruance for the honor, but Congress after World War II reverted to its arm's-length treatment of the military. Spruance was honored, however, by an appointment as ambassador to the Philippines, and served there with distinction until 1955. As for the other men, they had their ups and downs, as always happens in the peacetime service. Admiral Towers followed Spruance as Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, then went to the General Board for a time, and finally ended his career as a Vice President of Pan American World Airways. Admiral Lockwood, the submarine commander, enjoyed a very successful post-war career as a popular author of books on submarines. Admiral Jocko Clark, who believed he had engineered the replacement of Admiral Pownall as commander of fast carriers, was subjected to a Jovian revenge. His next assignment was to a training command under Pownall. The first years after the war were marred for Nimitz and his admirals by the controversy over unification of the services. Nimitz opposed unification to the point where he, on the one side, and Secretary Forrestal and President Truman were very nearly at an impasse. Nimitz had brought Forrest Sherman in as his Deputy Chief of Naval Operations, and they worked together. Admiral Radford worked with them. He was Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Air in those days. But the matter degenerated into squabbles that aroused irritations. The Nimitz admirals, old and young, did not have an easy time of it, although several of the younger men went on to very distinguished careers. W.H. Blandy became commander of the Atlantic Fleet, Forrest Sherman became Chief of Naval Operations, Arthur Radford commanded the Pacific Fleet and was later chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Jocko Clark commanded the 7th Fleet that fought the Korean War. Such different men. Clark, one might say, was a more modern Halsey, flamboyant and opinionated, but a fighter every inch. Radford, like Sherman, was a thinker. Sherman, somewhat like Spruance, was a strategist and a cool-headed fighter. Each was an individual. Sometimes it seemed remarkable that so many individuals of such different temperaments could be welded into a fighting team at all. There, of course, were the secrets of the principal admirals, Halsey, Spruance, and Nimitz. Halsey instilled in his men a fierce loyalty that was totally reciprocated. He was the favourite of the sailors of the fleet and of the people of the United States. Captain Harold Hopkins, a British liaison officer with the fleet, compared Halsey to Beatty, the British sea dog of World War I who fought at Jutland, or to Horatio Nelson or John Paul Jones. Spruance was the Jellicoe, the thoughtful commander with his eye on the campaign, not the battle. But finally, when it was said and done, it all came back to Nimitz, the blue-eyed, gentle Nimitz, hard as nails underneath, the professional naval officer who knew best of all how to get optimum performance from his major weapon, men. Nimitz shared with that great soldier, Dwight D. Eisenhower, a disarming and almost misleading appearance of ordinariness and diffidence. Like Eisenhower, Nimitz was a master at delegation of authority. Nimitz had a quality unique to himself too. There was always a sense of urgency and special responsibility to his delegations of authority. He wanted action, immediate, appropriate, and resultful action, and he nearly always got it. One can see the tremendous responsibility he gave Halsey and Spruance in the operation of the fleets, and the equal responsibility delegated to Lockwood in the submarines. The torpedo question, for example, was vital to the winning of the war. Nimitz and Lockwood conferred on the problem of the erratic performance and duds, and when Lockwood indicated that he suspected the source, and was working hard at locating the specific areas of difficulty and pushing the development of an electric torpedo to substitute for the faulty weapon if need be, then Nimitz, the old submarine officer, saw that Lockwood was doing everything he himself might have done, and he relegated the problem to the back of his mind and turned to immediate issues that he alone could resolve. Or take the matter of amphibious warfare. To be sure, Major General Holland Smith of the Marine Corps knew a great deal about amphibious warfare at the beginning of the war. It had been a specialty of his in the days before, as the art was being worked out. But few others knew much about amphibious warfare, especially top naval officers. It was Nimitz's genius that led him to search out Kelly Turner's mind when Turner was assigned by King to this task, and then to discover that Turner had a special aptitude for the work, and to accept Turner's judgments within the area of his competence. He let Turner pick his men, and let Turner have his head. The result was the development of amphibious warfare in the Pacific quickly and efficiently, to reach new dimensions, or take carrier warfare. Nimitz knew so little about air affairs and carrier warfare that Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman was callous enough to suggest in a letter that the Commander-in-Chief be replaced by an Air Admiral. And yet Nimitz was the one who shepherded the discussions of air power and use of the air forces in the Pacific. Under his command, the modernization of the tactics of carrier warfare took on new dimensions. It was not simply coincidental that the carrier men expanded and perfected their thinking in the Pacific. It was because Admiral Nimitz had the good sense to see that these young, eager specialists could do the job if they were given the responsibility and authority, and he gave it to them. In the files of the Naval War College, there exists a letter from Admiral Nimitz stating that all he knew about strategy he picked up at the college, and of course this was a little bit of icing on the cake, but the fact is that the War College battles did give him a basis for his thinking, just as King, Spruance and Halsey learned their lessons there. But there was a good deal more to command than prefabricated strategy. The Japanese had their equivalent of the War College too. Nimitz's great strength was his ability to coax the very best from others. In a way, his wardroom stories summed him up. He told them with the sure knowledge that they would go down the line and be repeated by the men on the lower decks of the ships of the fleet. One could say that Halsey was the man to win a battle for you, Spruance was the man to win a campaign, but Nimitz was the man to win a war.